The October afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green of Little Wickham, where the annual harvest festival had transformed the usually quiet common into a bustling tableau of rural English life. Bunting fluttered between the ancient oak trees, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh-baked bread, chrysanthemums, and the faint wood smoke from Mrs. Hartwell's cottage chimney. Children darted between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright faces, while their parents engaged in the gentle competition that marked such occasions, whose preserves would claim the blue ribbon, whose Victoria sponge would be deemed most worthy of praise. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a folding chair near the cake stall, her knitting resting in her lap as she observed the pleasant chaos with eyes that seemed mild, but missed very little. She had arrived in Little Wickham only recently to care for her ailing cousin Dorothy, but already she had begun to understand the intricate web of relationships that bound this small community together. Village life, she had long ago discovered, was rather like a complicated piece of needlework. Every thread connected to every other, and the pattern only became clear when one stepped back to view the whole. "Such a lovely turnout," remarked Mrs. Penelope Ashworth, the former head mistress who had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the festival. Her silver hair was arranged with military precision, and her pale blue eyes surveyed the proceedings with the same authority she had once brought to managing unruly school children. "Though I do hope the weather holds. Those clouds gathering over Wickham Hill look rather ominous." Miss Marple smiled gently, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm with the knitting needles. "Indeed, Mrs. Ashworth, though I've always found that the most interesting things often happen when the weather takes an unexpected turn. Rather like people, don't you think?" Mrs. Vivian Hartwell hurried past, her arms laden with a large wicker basket covered by a pristine white cloth. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, recently widowed and eager to establish herself within the village's social fabric. Her late husband had left her comfortably situated, but comfort, Miss Marple had observed, was no guarantee against loneliness or the desperate desire to belong. "The judging begins in 10 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell called over her shoulder to anyone who might be listening. "I do hope my lemon drizzle cake measures up to expectations." Near the main display table, the Reverend Ponsonby was arranging the prizes for the afternoon's grand raffle. The centerpiece was an exquisite Victorian cake tin, ornately embossed with silver-plated flourishes, a donation from the estate of the late Colonel Prothero. It gleamed under the autumn sun, drawing admiring glances from the villagers who paused to examine the raffle offerings. Miss Felicity Crowther, a sharp-featured spinster whose encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs made her both invaluable and formidable, approached the display with obvious interest. "Quite magnificent, isn't it?" she observed to no one in particular. "Though I must say, it seems rather large for most modern kitchens. The Colonel always did favor grand gestures over practical considerations." Mrs. Diana Thornfield, the newest resident of Little Wickham, stood slightly apart from the main crowd. She was an elegant woman with fashionably bobbed dark hair and clothes that spoke of London shops and sophisticated tastes. Her husband had purchased Meadowbrook House, the village's grandest property, but despite their obvious wealth, there was something guarded about Mrs. Thornfield's manner that suggested secrets carefully kept. As the afternoon progressed, the gentle rhythm of village life continued its familiar dance. The brass band played selections from Gilbert and Sullivan, children competed in sack races, and the ladies of the Women's Institute served tea and homemade biscuits with the efficiency of a well-drilled regiment. Miss Marple watched it all with quiet pleasure, noting the small dramas that played out beneath the surface of such gatherings. The meaningful glances, the careful avoidances, the subtle tensions that spoke of old grievances and newer anxieties. It was nearly 4 o'clock when young Timothy Fletcher, whose mother ran the village post office, was selected to draw the winning raffle tickets. The boy approached the task with the solemnity it deserved, his small hand disappearing into the large wooden drum that contained the folded slips of paper. "Sir, first prize," announced Reverend Ponsonby, his voice carrying clearly across the green. "The beautiful antique cake tin donated by the Prothero estate goes to—" He unfolded the slip with theatrical flourish. "Mrs. Vivian Hartwell." A ripple of applause swept through the crowd, but Mrs. Hartwell herself seemed frozen in place, her face suddenly pale. She approached the display table with obvious reluctance. Her earlier enthusiasm completely vanished. "Congratulations, my dear," said Mrs. Ashworth briskly. "Such a lovely prize. I'm sure you'll find it most useful." Mrs. Hartwell lifted the cake tin with trembling hands, and as she did so, something rattled softly inside. The sound was barely audible, but Miss Marple's keen ears caught it, as did several others nearby. "Oh," said Mrs. Hartwell faintly. "It seems there's something—" She lifted the tin's ornate lid, revealing not the empty interior everyone expected, but a cunningly concealed false bottom. And nestled within that hidden compartment, tied with a faded blue ribbon, lay a single envelope. The festive atmosphere suddenly felt charged with tension as Mrs. Hartwell stared down at the unexpected discovery, her hands shaking visibly now. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose quietly from her chair, her mild grey eyes fixed thoughtfully on the scene unfolding before her. The hush that had settled over the festival deepened as Mrs. Hartwell stood, motionless, the letter trembling in her grasp. For a moment, the only sound was the distant echo of the band's instruments, now discordant and out of place amidst the thickening tension. All eyes were on Mrs. Hartwell, whose face had drained of color, her composure visibly crumbling beneath the weight of the unexpected discovery. Mrs. Ashworth, never one to let uncertainty linger, stepped forward briskly. "Well, my dear, as you are the rightful winner, the decision is yours. Shall we see what has caused all this excitement?" Her tone strove for normality, but her glance flickered with curiosity and concern. The Reverend Ponsonby, sensing Mrs. Hartwell's distress, gently interceded. "Perhaps this is a matter better considered away from the crowd. If you wish, Mrs. Hartwell, we can retire to the church hall. There is no need for a public spectacle." Miss Felicity Crowther, always keen to insert herself where secrets were brewing, protested, "If the Colonel's estate donated the tin, surely whatever is inside was meant for the village, or at least for the light of day. We ought to know what it says." At this, Mrs. Hartwell seemed to shrink in on herself, clutching the envelope more tightly. Miss Marple, standing quietly behind the others, observed her reaction with keen interest. The trembling hands, the fixed stare, the way Mrs. Hartwell's eyes darted toward the faces around her, these were not the actions of a woman merely startled by surprise. There was fear, certainly, but also a peculiar kind of resignation, as though she had been awaiting this moment for years. After a moment's uncomfortable silence, Mrs. Diana Thornfield glided forward, her manner gentle but authoritative. "Let's at least give Mrs. Hartwell a chair and a glass of water. There's no need for a trial on the green." Her gaze lingered just a fraction too long on the envelope, as if she, too, was wrestling with memories best left unspoken. With the Reverend's support, the group moved into the cool, shaded interior of the church hall. The crowd, denied their drama, dispersed in uneasy knots, their voices already rising in speculative whispers. Miss Marple, bringing up the rear, noted the shifting alliances among the villagers, the way Mrs. Ashworth and Miss Crowther exchanged tight-lipped glances, the watchful interest of Mrs. Thornfield, and the absence of Harold Pritchard, the Colonel's solicitor, who had slipped away as soon as the commotion began. Inside, Mrs. Hartwell was seated at a long table, the cake tin and letter placed before her. The envelope's blue ribbon, now untied, revealed a faint dusting of glitter along its edge. Miss Marple, with the pretense of adjusting her spectacles, caught the faintest whiff of violet, an old-fashioned scent rarely found except among those who cherished memories or wished to disguise less pleasant odors. At last, with Trembling fingers, Mrs. Hartwell broke the seal and unfolded the letter. She hesitated, as if summoning courage, then began to read aloud, her voice thin but steady. "If this reaches you at last, then what I meant to keep quiet has been prized from its box by time and mischief. I chose you, VH, because you were always truthful in your way, which is to say, you could bear the weight of other people's lies. You know what happened at Meadowbrook. I was not alone. There is a note in the library ledger that will show how the key changed hands the night Mrs. Eversham fell. If you are reading this, it is because someone still wishes to make me pay for doing the wrong right. Ask the maid who saw the brooch. She will not speak unless asked by name." As she read, the air in the hall seemed to thicken, the letter's final words trailing into a silence that no one dared break. At the bottom, there was no signature, only the ghost of an initial, smudged beyond recognition. Miss Crowther, unable to restrain herself, burst out, "Mrs. Eversham, why that was years ago. Everyone knows she slipped after too much sherry." "Hush," the Reverend said sharply, his face grave. "This is not an occasion for conjecture." Harold Pritchard, having quietly re-entered, now stepped forward. "If the letter pertains to the Colonel's affairs, it should be kept safe, for legal reasons." He reached for the letter, but Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "I think it should remain with Mrs. Hartwell for now," Mrs. Ashworth interjected, her earlier briskness softened by sympathy. As the group debated, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a slender silk thread, pale and fine, lying on the floor where the tin had rested. With a discreet motion, she retrieved it with her knitting needle and tucked it away for consideration. She noted, too, the way Mrs. Thornfield's hand trembled as she reached for her handbag, the way young Timothy Fletcher, peering in from the doorway, whispered something urgent to his mother. Gradually, the group dissolved, each person departing with a new burden of suspicion or fear. Mr. Pritchard, after some hesitation, locked the letter in his briefcase, offering solemn assurances that it would be kept secure. Mrs. Hartwell, looking suddenly older, allowed Mrs. Thornfield to escort her home, the two women disappearing down the lane in a silence thick with unspoken questions. Back on the green, the festival's music resumed, but the gaiety was gone. The villagers clustered in anxious groups, speculation running wild. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, watched the shifting faces with calm attentiveness. She knew, as only she could, that the letter's appearance had unsettled not just the surface of village life, but the careful concealment of its darkest secrets. Here, in Little Wickham, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The evening shadows lengthened across Little Wickham as the last of the festival stalls were dismantled, but the usual post-celebration contentment was notably absent. Instead, clusters of villagers lingered in animated conversation, their voices carrying an undercurrent of unease that had not been present since morning. Miss Marple, making her way slowly toward Cousin Dorothy's cottage, observed these gatherings with the practiced eye of someone who understood that the most revealing conversations often took place when people believed themselves unobserved. Mrs. Ashworth and Miss Crowther stood near the church gate, their heads bent together in urgent conference. The former headmistress's military bearing had given way to something approaching agitation, while Miss Crowther's sharp features were animated with the particular gleam that came when scandal presented itself for examination. Near the post office, Harold Pritchard lingered with uncharacteristic indecision, his briefcase clutched tightly as though its contents might escape if his grip loosened even slightly. At Dorothy's cottage, Miss Marple found her cousin considerably more alert than she had been in days, propped up in her chair by the sitting-room window with a clear view of the village's main thoroughfare. Despite her frailty, Dorothy possessed the invaluable gift of an encyclopedic memory for local affairs, and tonight her pale eyes held the brightness that came when long-buried memories stirred to life. "Such excitement," Dorothy murmured as Miss Marple settled into the opposite chair, her knitting basket at her feet. I haven't seen the village so unsettled since the business with the Ashford family's bankruptcy. That letter has certainly stirred up old waters." Miss Marple's needles began their gentle rhythm, though her attention remained focused on her cousin's words. "Mrs. Evesham," she said quietly. "I confess the name is not entirely unfamiliar, but the details escape me." Dorothy's voice took on the careful cadence of someone retrieving facts from the deeper recesses of memory. "She was a housekeeper at Meadowbrook for the Ashford family, devoted to them for nearly 20 years. When they lost their fortune and had to sell, she stayed on to help with the transition. A proud woman, very particular about proper standards. Her death was quite shocking, found at the bottom of the main staircase on a February morning about 3 years ago now. The constable ruled it accidental, said she'd had too much to drink and lost her footing on those polished steps." Through the lace curtains, Miss Marple observed young Timothy Fletcher hurrying past with his mother, the boy's earnest face turned up toward Mrs. Fletcher in animated conversation. Something in his manner suggested urgency, the kind of excitement that comes when a child believes they possess important information that adults have overlooked. "The letter mentioned a brooch and a maid," Miss Marple observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Do you recall anything about either?" Dorothy's eyes brightened with particular satisfaction that came when her formidable memory was properly engaged. "Oh yes, there was quite a commotion about Mrs. Evesham's brooch. A lovely Victorian piece with garnets and seed pearls, quite valuable. She claimed it had been stolen the week before her death, made quite a fuss about it with anyone who would listen. But it was found among her effects afterward, which led people to think she'd simply mislaid it during one of her confused spells. She'd been drinking rather more heavily those last months, you see." The front gate's familiar creak announced a visitor, and Miss Marple looked up to see Mrs. Thornfield approaching through the gathering dusk. The elegant woman's usual composure was notably strained, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone fighting to maintain control. Her fashionable coat was perfectly arranged, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves. Dorothy, despite her weakness, insisted on receiving their visitor properly, and soon Mrs. Thornfield was seated in the small parlor, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that she seemed reluctant to actually drink. The firelight caught the subtle sparkle of her silk scarf, tiny particles of glitter that seemed to dance in the warm glow. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice carefully modulated, "I find myself rather unsettled by this afternoon's events. Not because I believe there's any truth to the letter's implications, you understand, but because of the damage such accusations might do to innocent people. My husband and I have worked so hard to establish ourselves here." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes studied her visitor with gentle attention, noting the way Mrs. Thornfield's cup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. It must be particularly difficult, having purchased the very house where Mrs. Evesham met her unfortunate end. Such associations can be troubling, even when one knows them to be merely coincidental. The colour drained from Mrs. Thornfield's face, and she set down her cup with excessive care. "Indeed. Though, of course, we thoroughly investigated the property's history before purchasing. My husband is most meticulous about such matters. We were assured that Mrs. Evesham's death was entirely accidental." "How reassuring," Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Though I confess, I find myself curious about the reference to a library ledger. Such specific details often prove significant, don't you think?" Mrs. Thornfield's hands tightened in her lap. "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that. We've made considerable changes to the house since purchasing it, including converting the old library into a modern morning room. Most of the previous contents were disposed of or donated to the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How generous of you. I do hope any documents of historical interest found their way to appropriate hands. Such things can be so revealing about a community's past." Mrs. Thornfield rose abruptly, her composure finally showing visible cracks. "I really must return home. Charles will be wondering where I've gotten to." She paused at the door, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Miss Marple, I do hope you won't encourage any unnecessary speculation about this afternoon's discovery. Small communities can be so easily damaged by unfounded rumors. After she left, Miss Marple sat quietly in the deepening twilight, her fingers working automatically while her mind processed the evening's revelations. From her knitting basket, she retrieved the slender silk thread she'd collected earlier, holding it up to the lamplight. It was not merely pale, but actually silver blue, remarkably fine, and bore the faintest trace of glitter along its length, the kind used in expensive embroideries or theatrical applications. Dorothy, who had remained unusually quiet during Mrs. Thornfield's visit, finally spoke. "That woman is thoroughly frightened, Jane, and in my experience, people are rarely so afraid of lies as they are of truths that might be discovered." The next morning brought crisp autumn air and the kind of clarity that seemed to sharpen both sight and memory. Miss Marple made her way to the post office, ostensibly to purchase stamps, but primarily to engage Mrs. Fletcher in conversation. The postmistress was a woman of quiet demeanor whose ears were remarkably attuned to the village's pulse, and her memory for local history was both prodigious and precise. "Rather shocking events at the festival yesterday," Miss Marple observed gently as she examined the selection of stamps. Poor Mrs. Hartwell seemed quite overcome by the discovery. Mrs. Fletcher nodded gravely, her round face troubled. "Indeed, Miss Marple, such a thing to find after all these years. It brings back memories that many would prefer to leave buried." Timothy appeared from the back room, his young face bright with barely contained excitement. He had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to speak, and his mother's resigned sigh suggested this was not the first time he had pressed to share his observations. "Miss Marple," he said earnestly, "I saw something yesterday, before the raffle. When Reverend Ponsonby sent me to fetch the second book of tickets from the vestry, I passed by the raffle table to get a closer look at that beautiful tin. There was a lady standing very near it, and her scarf got caught on the clasp. When she pulled it free, I noticed tiny sparkles on the ribbon inside the tin, the same kind of sparkles that were on her scarf." Mrs. Fletcher's face tightened with maternal concern. "Timothy, you shouldn't be making such observations about your elders." But Miss Marple leaned forward with genuine interest. "Which lady was this, Timothy? It's quite observant of you to notice such details." The boy glanced at his mother, then back to Miss Marple. "Mrs. Thornfield, the London lady. Her scarf was very fine, with little sparkles woven through it. And later, when the tin was opened, the ribbon had the same kind of glitter." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "You have very sharp eyes, Timothy. Such attention to detail is a valuable quality." She turned to Mrs. Fletcher. "I confess, I was but a visitor here when Mrs. Evesham passed, and the details are rather hazy. Was there a maid who worked at Meadowbrook then? Someone who might have witnessed the events of that evening?" Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the window. "There was a young woman, yes. Lily Pike, though she was Lily Meacham then. She'd been in service to Mrs. Evesham for several years, a quiet, timid thing. Very much under her mistress's thumb, everyone said. She left shortly after Mrs. Evesham's death, married a carpenter named Ted Pike, and moved to a cottage by the ford. And she would have been present the night Mrs. Evesham fell. Oh yes, she lived in the house. Always wore a little silver brooch shaped like a thistle. Said it was from her grandmother. Mrs. Evesham was quite particular about her staff's appearance, but she allowed Lily that one small vanity." Mrs. Fletcher paused, then added thoughtfully, "I remember thinking at the time that Lily seemed more frightened than grieved by her mistress's death. But then, Mrs. Evesham could be quite demanding." Miss Marple thanked them both, her mind already weaving together the threads of information. The letter's reference to the maid who saw the brooch was becoming clearer, as was the significance of the specific request that she will not speak unless asked by name. As she made her way back through the village, Miss Marple reflected that the Colonel's posthumous message was proving to be not merely a confession, but a carefully constructed puzzle designed to lead the right person to the truth, if they possessed the wisdom to ask the proper questions of the proper people. The peaceful facade of Little Wickham was beginning to reveal the darker currents that flowed beneath its surface, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, several more carefully guarded secrets would be brought into the light. The walk to Lily Pike's cottage took Miss Marple along the winding lane that followed Little Wickham's modest stream, where morning mist still clung to the willows, and the air carried the crisp promise of autumn's deeper embrace. The small dwelling, nestled between ancient trees, bore the unmistakable signs of quiet industry. Freshly painted window boxes, a carefully tended garden, and the general air of modest prosperity that spoke well of Ted Pike's carpentry skills and his wife's domestic management. Lily Pike answered Miss Marple's gentle knock with the cautious demeanor of someone long accustomed to keeping her own counsel. She was a woman in her early 30s, with a kind of understated prettiness that had probably been quite striking in youth, but had settled into something more comfortable with the passing years. Her hands, Miss Marple noted with her characteristic attention to detail, bore the telltale signs of practical work. Not the soft hands of leisure, but capable fingers that spoke of pride in honest accomplishment. "Mrs. Pike," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if I might impose upon your time for a few moments. I'm Jane Marple, staying with my cousin Dorothy while she recovers. I confess I find myself rather curious about our village's history, particularly regarding the grand houses and their former inhabitants." The mention of grand houses brought an immediate tightening around Lily's eyes, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm not sure I can help you much, Miss Marple. Ted and I keep mostly to ourselves these days." "Of course, my dear. Though I understand you once worked at Meadowbrook House before the Thornfields purchased it. Such a magnificent property. I imagine it must have been quite an experience." The color drained from Lily's face, and her grip tightened visibly on the doorframe. After a moment's hesitation, she led Miss Marple into a small but immaculately kept sitting room, where simple but well-made furniture, clearly Ted Pike's handiwork, created an atmosphere of peaceful sanctuary. On the mantelpiece, Miss Marple observed a small silver brooch in the shape of a thistle, exactly as Mrs. Fletcher had described. "That's a lovely piece," Miss Marple remarked, settling comfortably with her knitting. "Family heirloom." Lily's hand moved instinctively toward her throat. "My grandmother's, yes. Mrs. Evesham was very particular about jewelry. Said my thistle brooch was common, but she allowed me to wear it because it reminded her of Scotland, where she'd spent her childhood." Miss Marple's needles began their gentle rhythm, and gradually Lily's rigid posture began to relax. "I imagine Mrs. Evesham was quite attached to her own pieces." "Oh, she was that. Especially the garnet brooch with the seed pearls. Victorian it was, and she was always going on about how it represented proper standards of a bygone era." Lily's voice carried a bitter edge. "She claimed it went missing before her death, made a terrible fuss about it, but I saw that brooch the very night she died, Miss Marple. Saw it clear as day." The admission hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple could sense the weight of the secret that Lily had carried for 3 long years. "That must have been very troubling for you, my dear, to see something that contradicted what everyone believed to be true." Lily's hands twisted in her lap. Mrs. Evesham had received a visitor that evening, someone she wasn't expecting. After they left, she was in a terrible state, muttering about people not knowing their place, about secrets that should stay buried. But before that, when I took up the tea tray, I heard voices from the library, not arguing exactly, but hushed and intense. "And the brooch?" When the visitor was leaving, I saw it, pinned to her coat, a beautiful dark blue wool with silver buttons and silk lining that caught the lamplight. The garnet brooch was there, clear as anything, but by morning, after they found Mrs. Evesham at the bottom of the stairs, the brooch was back in her jewelry box. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging. "Did you recognize this coat, Lily?" The younger woman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'd seen it before in the village, though I couldn't place where until later. It was at Mrs. Eversham's funeral, the same coat worn by someone who stood at the very back of the church and left before the service ended. But you never spoke of this to the authorities. Lily shook her head miserably. Who would have believed me, a housemaid against a person of standing? I was frightened, Miss Marple. I married Ted and tried to put it all behind me. Miss Marple's expression remained gently sympathetic, though her mind was rapidly processing this new information alongside the other pieces of the puzzle. The letter mentioned a key and a ledger, my dear. Did Mrs. Eversham ever speak of such things? She gave me a small note just before her death, Lily whispered. Said I might need its protection one day. It was just a few words. The key is not where it should be. The ledger will show. I didn't understand it then. Mrs. Eversham had been drinking heavily, and she seemed so agitated. Through the cottage window, Miss Marple caught sight of a familiar figure walking briskly along the lane. Mrs. Thornfield, her elegant coat billowing behind her in the autumn breeze. Even at this distance, there was something purposeful about her movement that suggested more than a casual constitutional. Tell me, Lily, Miss Marple said quietly. This coat you saw that night, would you recognize it again? Lily followed Miss Marple's gaze toward the window, and her face went white as chalk. That's it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's the very coat. As they watched, Mrs. Thornfield paused at the cottage gate, her hand resting on the latch as though debating whether to enter. For a long moment she stood there, her face turned toward the house, and even from this distance Miss Marple could sense the tension in her posture. Then, apparently thinking better of whatever impulse had brought her here, Mrs. Thornfield turned and walked quickly back toward the village center. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. The pattern was becoming clearer, though several threads remained frustratingly tangled. The library ledger that Miss Crowther had mentioned, the key referenced in both the Colonel's letter and Mrs. Eversham's note, the brooch that had traveled from victim to visitor and back again, all spoke of a carefully orchestrated deception that had succeeded for 3 years. I think, my dear Lily, she said gently, that the time has come for the truth to be told properly. But first, we must ensure that all the pieces fit together as they should. The Colonel's letter was quite specific about the ledger, showing how the key changed hands. I believe a visit to the Women's Institute might prove most illuminating. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she reflected that Mrs. Thornfield's nervous appearance at the cottage gate was perhaps the most telling clue yet. The woman was clearly aware that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, and desperate people, as Miss Marple well knew, were capable of desperate measures. The Women's Institute occupied the former village schoolhouse, a sturdy brick building whose high windows and polished floors still carried echoes of childhood recitations and stern moral instruction. Miss Marple arrived to find the usual Thursday afternoon gathering in full swing, with Mrs. Ashworth presiding over the weekly business with her characteristic military efficiency, while Miss Crowther supervised the sorting of donated materials for the upcoming jumble sale. The atmosphere, however, carried an undercurrent of tension that had not been present before yesterday's dramatic discovery. Miss Marple? Mrs. Ashworth greeted her with a brightness that seemed slightly forced. How lovely to see you joining us. We were just discussing the organization of the Meadowbrook donations. Such a generous contribution from the estate, though it has created quite a cataloguing challenge. Miss Crowther looked up from her work, her sharp eyes gleaming with the particular satisfaction that came from being the keeper of institutional memory. Indeed, 3 generations of accumulated books and papers. The Ashford family were great collectors, though their filing system left much to be desired. We've been sorting through household ledgers, correspondence, even Mrs. Eversham's meticulous records of daily expenses and visitor logs. Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, noting the way several conversations had paused at her arrival. How fascinating. I imagine such documents provide a wonderful glimpse into the daily life of a great house. Mrs. Evesham sounds to have been most thorough in her duties. Obsessively so, Miss Crowther confirmed, warming to her subject. That woman documented everything: who visited, when they arrived, which rooms they accessed. She even maintained a detailed inventory of household keys and their distribution. She gestured toward a collection of leather-bound volumes on a nearby table. All terribly mundane, of course, but historically significant in its way. Mrs. Ashworth's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Perhaps we shouldn't dwell on such personal matters, Felicity. Poor Mrs. Evesham deserves her privacy, even in death. But Miss Marple had already moved toward the indicated volumes, her mild grey eyes scanning the carefully arranged collection. I do hope these records found their way to appropriate hands. Such meticulous documentation often proves invaluable for understanding a household's operations. Miss Crowther, pleased to have found an appreciative audience, continued despite Mrs. Ashworth's obvious discomfort. We've been most careful with the sensitive materials. Mr. Pritchard insisted on reviewing everything personally before it was released to our care. Quite proper, given his responsibilities to the estate. Miss Marple's fingers traced the spine of one particular ledger, noting the way it sat slightly askew from the others. When she opened it, the reason became immediately apparent. 2 pages had been carefully removed, leaving only the faintest ghost of their former presence in the binding's tight stitching. The marbled end papers showed the precision of the cut, and what remained bore the subtle indentations that paper retains long after the original writing has been removed. "How curious," she murmured, angling the book toward the window's afternoon light. The raking illumination revealed the pressure marks more clearly, the distinctive 7s with their continental crossbars, the careful notation of times, and in the margin where a signature might have been, the faint impression of initials that could have been H.P. or perhaps H.F. Mrs. Ashworth appeared at her shoulder with suspicious promptness. I'm afraid the years haven't been kind to some of the older volumes. Mice and moisture, you know. Such a pity when historical documents suffer damage. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed gently, though her keen nose had detected something else entirely. The faint, sweet scent of violet water clinging to the pages, old-fashioned and distinctive. Though sometimes what appears to be damage reveals its own story. Paper has such a remarkable memory, don't you think? The arrival of Reverend Ponsonby provided a welcome distraction from the increasingly tense atmosphere. He entered carrying a substantial ring of keys, his mild features creased with the particular worry that came from dealing with administrative complexities beyond his natural inclinations. "Ladies, I hope I'm not interrupting. Mr. Pritchard has requested access to the parish safe again. Something about ensuring all the Prothero estate items are properly documented. He's been most thorough in his responsibilities." Miss Marple observed the keys with her characteristic attention to detail, noting the fresh scratches along one particular brass shaft, the kind of marks that appeared when a second, ill-fitting key had been used in the same lock. How conscientious of Mr. Pritchard. I imagine the Colonel's effects require careful handling, given their value and provenance. "Oh, yes," the Reverend confirmed. "He's had duplicate keys made for several of our security measures. Says it's essential for proper estate management, though I confess I sometimes wonder if we're being overly cautious about a simple cake tin and some old books." The mention of duplicate keys sent a small thrill of understanding through Miss Marple's consciousness, though her expression remained placidly interested. Caution is rarely misplaced when dealing with valuable items, though I suppose the real treasures often hide in the most unexpected places. Mr. Pritchard himself appeared as if summoned by their conversation, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. His briefcase, clutched perhaps a touch too tightly, seemed to carry more weight than its contents should warrant. "Reverend ladies," he greeted them, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone choosing their words with unusual care. "I trust I'm not disturbing your important work. I only require a few moments with the safe contents. Purely routine documentation, you understand." As he spoke, Miss Marple caught the same elusive scent she had detected on the ledger pages. Violet water, faint but unmistakable. When he produced a small square of blotting paper from his case, the fragrance became more pronounced, speaking of old-fashioned writing habits and careful attention to presentation. "Such a pleasant fragrance," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It reminds me of my dear Aunt Helen's writing desk. She always kept a sachet of violet petals beneath her correspondence paper. So soothing for the nerves during difficult correspondence." Mr. Pritchard's color heightened slightly as he tucked the blotter away with unnecessary haste. "An old habit, Miss Marple. Modern inks can be so harsh on the senses." After he departed with the Reverend, Miss Marple remained quietly thoughtful, her knitting needles working with their usual steady rhythm while her mind arranged the emerging pattern of evidence. The missing pages from Mrs. Eversham's ledger, the violet-scented blotting paper, the duplicate keys and fresh scratches on brass, all spoke of careful preparation and methodical execution. Miss Crowther, emboldened by Mr. Pritchard's departure, leaned closer to Miss Marple. "I probably shouldn't mention this, but there was something rather odd about how those particular ledger pages went missing. When we first received the donation, that volume was intact. The damage only appeared after Mr. Pritchard's first inspection." Mrs. Ashworth's face had taken on the rigid expression of someone desperately trying to maintain control of an increasingly volatile situation. "Felicity, I hardly think we should be making such implications. Mr. Pritchard has been nothing but professional in his duties." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed soothingly, though her mild grey eyes held a sharpness that suggested her thoughts were moving in directions that would soon prove most illuminating. "Professional duties can be so complex, particularly when they involve protecting the interests of multiple parties. Sometimes the most conscientious approach requires creative solutions to delicate problems." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple made her way home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had added several crucial pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle. The Colonel's posthumous letter was proving to be not merely a confession, but a carefully constructed challenge, one that required the right person to ask the right questions of the right evidence. The peaceful facade of Little Wickham continued to reveal the darker currents flowing beneath its surface, and Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. That evening brought an unexpected visitor to Dorothy's cottage, arriving just as the last light was fading from the October sky. Mrs. Hartwell stood at the front door, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and her hands trembling visibly as she clutched a small leather journal against her chest. The confident woman who had won the raffle prize had been replaced by someone whose composure was hanging by the thinnest of threads. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must speak with you about the Colonel's letter. I fear I know more about Mrs. Eversham's final days than I initially admitted, and with all this talk of ledgers and keys, I can no longer remain silent." Dorothy, despite her frailty, insisted on receiving Mrs. Hartwell properly, and soon the three women were arranged around the small fire that Miss Marple had kindled against the evening's chill. Mrs. Hartwell accepted a cup of tea with hands that shook so violently the china rattled against the saucer, and Miss Marple noticed the faint but unmistakable scent of violet water clinging to her visitor's clothing. "My late husband Thomas was the Ashford family's solicitor," Mrs. Hartwell began, her voice gaining strength as she committed to her revelation. "He handled their affairs during the final years before they lost everything. The family's financial ruin wasn't as sudden as everyone believed. It was a carefully orchestrated decline that benefited certain individuals who knew exactly when and how to position themselves." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, though her attention was completely focused on Mrs. Hartwell's words. The pattern she had been sensing was finally beginning to take clearer shape, and she suspected that the threads connecting the Colonel's letter to Mrs. Eversham's death were about to be revealed. "Mrs. Eversham discovered irregularities in the property transaction," Mrs. Hartwell continued, opening the leather journal she had brought. She kept meticulous records of everything: visitor logs, key distributions, even notes about conversations she overheard. She was convinced that someone had used inside knowledge to manipulate the sale of Meadowbrook House, ensuring it sold for far less than its true value. Through the cottage window, Miss Marple observed a familiar figure hurrying along the lane. Mr. Pritchard, his briefcase clutched tightly against his chest, and his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. His appearance at this hour suggested that the careful arrangements he had been maintaining were beginning to unravel. The Colonel's letter mentioned a key changing hands, Dorothy observed, her pale eyes bright with understanding. Mrs. Evesham documented this, didn't she? Mrs. Hartwell nodded, her fingers tracing the journal's worn pages. She recorded everything in her private ledger: the master key to Meadowbrook that was supposedly returned to the estate but was actually duplicated, the late-night visits to examine confidential papers, even the identity of the person who orchestrated the entire scheme. She called it her insurance policy against those who thought they could profit from the Ashfords' misfortune. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her full attention now focused on the implications of this revelation. And she threatened to expose this information? She confronted the guilty party directly, Mrs. Hartwell whispered. 3 days before her death, she sent a message demanding a meeting. She said she had evidence that would ruin reputations and possibly lead to criminal charges. She was prepared to take her documentation to the authorities. The cottage gate creaked open, and through the lace curtains they could see Mrs. Thornfield approaching through the gathering darkness. This time, however, her usual elegant composure had given way to something approaching desperation, and her knock on the door carried an urgency that spoke of secrets finally demanding their due. Miss Marple rose to answer the door, noting that Mrs. Thornfield's expensive coat bore a small mended area near the collar, exactly where a brooch might have been torn away in a struggle. The repair work was exquisite, done with silver-blue thread that caught the lamplight with tiny sparkles of glitter. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mrs. Thornfield said without preamble, her voice strained, "I understand you've been discussing old business with Miss Marple. I felt it necessary to clarify certain misconceptions that might have arisen." Miss Marple observed the way Mrs. Thornfield's gaze immediately went to the leather journal in Mrs. Hartwell's lap, and how her hands clenched when she noticed its familiar appearance. The violet scent that had been haunting various locations throughout the village was particularly strong tonight, emanating from Mrs. Thornfield's person with an intensity that suggested recent and liberal application. "Please do sit down," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm sure we're all interested in understanding the complete picture of what happened to poor Mrs. Evesham." Mrs. Thornfield's composure cracked slightly. Mrs. Evesham was a troubled woman in her final months, given to wild accusations and paranoid fantasies. Any documentation she might have kept should be viewed in that light. Yet the Colonel seemed to take her concerns quite seriously, Mrs. Hartwell observed, her voice stronger now. Seriously enough to arrange for the truth to emerge even after his death. Miss Marple watched the interplay between the two women with the keen attention of someone who understood that crucial revelations were imminent. The violet scent, the mended coat, the missing ledger pages, and now Mrs. Evesham's private journal, all the pieces were finally converging toward the moment when Little Wickham's most carefully guarded secret would be exposed. Mrs. Thornfield's eyes darted between the journal and Miss Marple's mild but penetrating gaze, and for the first time since arriving in the village, her mask of sophisticated composure slipped entirely. The woman who had purchased Meadowbrook House so advantageously was about to discover that some bargains came with prices that could never truly be paid. The silence that followed Mrs. Thornfield's arrival stretched uncomfortably through the small cottage parlor, broken only by the gentle ticking of Dorothy's mantel clock and the soft whisper of settling coals in the grate. Miss Marple observed with quiet interest how the elegant woman's composure had begun to fray at the edges, her usual sophisticated bearing replaced by something approaching desperation. The violet scent that had haunted various locations throughout the village was particularly pronounced tonight, emanating from Mrs. Thornfield's person with an intensity that suggested recent and liberal application. Mrs. Hartwell, emboldened by Miss Marple's presence and the weight of truth she carried in her late husband's journal, opened the leather volume with steadier hands than she had possessed all evening. Perhaps Mrs. Thornfield would be interested in what Mrs. Eversham actually documented, she said, her voice gaining strength. These aren't the ramblings of a confused woman, but the methodical observations of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. The pages revealed Mrs. Eversham's precise handwriting, each entry dated and detailed with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of professional training and natural suspicion. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, noting how Mrs. Thornfield's eyes fixed on the journal with the desperate attention of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. Here, Fidem, Mrs. Hartwell continued, pointing to an entry dated 3 weeks before Mrs. Eversham's death. She writes about discovering that the master key to Meadowbrook's library had been duplicated without proper authorization. She found evidence that someone had been accessing confidential family papers during the final stages of the property sale negotiations. Mrs. Thornfield's laugh carried a brittle edge that seemed to crack the very air around them. Mrs. Eversham was drinking heavily during that period, as everyone in the village well knew. Her perceptions were hardly reliable, and her accusations were nothing more than the bitter fantasies of a woman who couldn't accept that her employers had lost their fortune. Miss Marple's mild grey eyes studied Mrs. Thornfield with the kind of gentle but penetrating attention that had unravelled so many carefully constructed deceptions over the years. Yet she was sober enough to document specific dates, times, and remarkably precise observations, she observed quietly. Rather like the way she noted that her valuable garnet brooch had gone missing, only to mysteriously reappear among her effects after her death. The cottage door suddenly burst open without warning, admitting Mr. Pritchard in a state of obvious agitation that was completely at odds with his usual composed demeanor. His carefully arranged hair was disheveled, his face pale with what appeared to be genuine shock, and his hands trembled as he clutched his briefcase against his chest. "There's been a break-in at the church," he announced breathlessly, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "The vestry safe has been tampered with, and several items are missing. The Reverend discovered it when he went to lock up after choir practice." The effect of this announcement was immediate and telling. Mrs. Thornfield's face went white as chalk, while Mrs. Hartwell instinctively clutched the journal more tightly to her chest. Miss Marple, however, remained outwardly calm, though her keen mind was already processing the implications of this convenient development. "How distressing," she murmured, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "I trust the Reverend wasn't harmed." Such incidents are quite unusual in Little Wickham. Mr. Pritchard shook his head, though his agitation remained palpable. "No one was hurt, thankfully, but the Colonel's letter has been taken, along with one of the household ledgers that had been placed there for safekeeping. The lock shows signs of having been forced, though rather expertly done." Miss Marple's experienced eye caught the way Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Pritchard exchanged glances. Brief but laden with the kind of desperate communication that passes between conspirators whose carefully laid plans are beginning to unravel. The violet scent seemed to intensify in the confined space, and she noted that both visitors bore traces of the distinctive fragrance. "How very convenient for someone," Mrs. Hartwell observed with surprising steel in her voice, "that the physical evidence should disappear just as we were beginning to understand its significance." Mrs. Thornfield's composure finally cracked visibly. "You can't possibly suggest that I had anything to do with a break-in. I've been here with you all evening, and before that I was at home with my husband. Charles can verify my whereabouts completely." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully, noting the way Mrs. Thornfield's hand moved instinctively to her coat collar, where the fine silver-blue mending work caught the lamplight with tiny sparkles of glitter. "Of course, my dear. though I confess I find it curious how these unfortunate incidents seem to coincide with moments when the truth threatens to emerge. From her knitting basket, Miss Marple retrieved the slender, silk thread she had collected at the festival, holding it up to the light where its silver-blue color and glittering surface became unmistakable. I found this near the cake tin when it was opened. Quite distinctive thread, the kind used in expensive embroidery work or perhaps in mending fine garments. Mrs. Thornfield's eyes fixed on the thread with obvious recognition, and her breathing became noticeably shallow. Mr. Pritchard stepped closer to her, his presence clearly intended as support, but Miss Marple observed how his own hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. Young Timothy Fletcher appeared in the doorway, his earnest face bright with the excitement of possessing important information. "Miss Marple," he said urgently, "Mother sent me to tell you that she remembered something about the night Mrs. Evesham died. She said Lily Pike might want to know that someone was seen leaving Meadowbrook very late that evening, wearing a dark coat with silver buttons that caught the moonlight." The boy's innocent revelation fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that seemed to touch everyone present. Mrs. Thornfield's hand flew to her throat, and Mr. Pritchard's briefcase slipped from his nervous fingers, spilling several papers that included what appeared to be pages torn from ledgers. Pages that bore Mrs. Evesham's distinctive handwriting and showed the telltale marks of violet-scented blotting paper. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her mild demeanor unchanged, but her presence somehow commanding the room's complete attention. "I believe," she said gently, "that Mrs. Evesham's journal and the Colonel's letter were both designed to guide us toward the same truth. The break-in tonight, rather than destroying evidence, has actually confirmed that someone is desperately afraid of what that evidence might reveal." Through the cottage window, the peaceful lights of Little Wickham twinkled in the darkness, unaware that one of its most carefully guarded secrets was finally being brought into the light. Miss Marple reflected that the village's tranquil facade had once again proven to conceal the kind of human drama that made even the most improbable fiction seem pale by comparison. The game, as she well knew, was now truly afoot, and the final moves would soon be played. The scattered papers from Mr. Pritchard's briefcase lay across Dorothy's parlor floor like accusatory fingers pointing in directions he had never intended them to go. Miss Marple, with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that truth emerged best when allowed to unfold naturally, began gathering the documents while maintaining her characteristic air of gentle helpfulness. Each page she collected revealed another fragment of the carefully concealed deception that had been festering beneath Little Wickham's tranquil surface for 3 long years. Mrs. Hartwell, emboldened by the mounting evidence and the presence of witnesses, opened her late husband's journal to a page she had clearly marked for this very moment. "Thomas documented everything with a thoroughness that made him such a respected solicitor," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The unauthorized duplication of keys, the midnight access to confidential family papers, even the precise dates when someone used inside knowledge to manipulate Meadowbrook's sale negotiations. He called it sophisticated fraud, executed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their position of trust." Mr. Pritchard's face had taken on the grayish pallor of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "Thomas Hartwell was a bitter man," he said desperately, his usual composed demeanor cracking visibly. "He resented being excluded from the property transaction. These allegations are nothing more than the vengeful fantasies of someone who couldn't accept professional disappointment." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes studied the solicitor with the kind of gentle but penetrating attention that had unraveled so many elaborate deceptions over the years. From among the scattered papers, she had retrieved a sheet bearing Mrs. Evesham's distinctive handwriting and the telltale violet-scented blotting marks that had become such a significant element in this puzzle. "How interesting," she observed quietly, holding the page up to the lamplight where the pressure marks from the original writing became more visible. "Mrs. Evesham's documentation appears to support every detail of Mr. Hartwell's observations. Rather remarkable coincidence, don't you think, that two independent sources should arrive at such identical conclusions. Mrs. Thornfield, who had remained frozen in her chair like a beautiful statue whose composure was beginning to show hairline cracks, finally found her voice. "You're creating elaborate fantasies based on nothing more than coincidence and the confused ramblings of a woman who drank too much in her final months," she declared, though her hand moved instinctively to cover the mended area at her coat collar where silver-blue thread caught the firelight with tiny sparkles. Young Timothy Fletcher, who had been listening with the wide-eyed attention that children bring to adult mysteries, stepped forward with the earnest determination that only the young possess when they know they have witnessed something important. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the tense silence, "I saw you yesterday evening, walking very quickly past our cottage toward the church. Your coat was torn at the collar then, and you were carrying something small in your hand that caught the moonlight. Mother remarked on it because she thought you might have been hurt." The boy's innocent observation fell into the room like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples of implication that seemed to touch everyone present. Mrs. Thornfield's carefully maintained composure finally began to show visible cracks, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the weight of accumulating evidence pressed down upon her. Dorothy, despite her frailty, leaned forward with the sharp intelligence that illness had not dimmed. "The violet water," she said suddenly, her voice carrying the clarity of understanding. Mrs. Eversham always used violet water on her correspondence. It was her signature scent, something she'd maintained since her youth in Scotland. But she stopped using it in her final weeks, told Lily Pike it reminded her too much of betrayal and deception. Miss Marple nodded approvingly at her cousin's insight, understanding immediately how this detail illuminated the larger pattern of deception that had been hidden for so long. Mrs. Eversham discovered that someone had been forging documents using paper scented with her distinctive violet water. She continued gently, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic motion. Letters that appeared to come from her but actually authorized actions she would never have approved. The garnet brooch wasn't stolen at all. It was taken as security for her silence, then carefully returned after her death to maintain the fiction that she had been confused and unreliable. Mr. Pritchard made one final desperate attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. Even if any of these wild theories contained a grain of truth, which they don't, you have no concrete proof that would satisfy any reasonable authority. The break-in at the church was clearly the work of common thieves who happened upon items they thought might be valuable. But Timothy Fletcher, with the unwavering honesty that made children such dangerous witnesses to adult deceptions, stepped forward once more. "Mr. Pritchard," he said with the matter-of-fact directness of youth, "I saw you giving Mrs. Thornfield the church keys this afternoon near the post office. You told her something about making sure all the evidence was properly secured for everyone's protection." The boy's revelation struck the assembled group like lightning illuminating a landscape that had been hidden in shadow. Mrs. Thornfield's face went white as chalk, while Mr. Pritchard seemed to age a decade in as many seconds. The violet scent that had haunted various locations throughout the village suddenly seemed overwhelming in the confined space of the cottage parlor. Speaking eloquently of guilt and desperation, finally brought into the harsh light of truth. Miss Marple observed them both with a compassionate understanding of someone who had witnessed too much of human nature's darker manifestations to be truly surprised by even its most elaborate deceptions. She set aside her knitting and rose quietly from her chair, her presence somehow commanding the room's complete attention despite her mild demeanor. "I believe," she said gently, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "that we have reached the point where the truth can no longer be avoided. Mrs. Eversham was not the victim of an accidental fall brought on by excessive drinking. She was murdered by people she trusted, individuals who used their positions of authority and respectability to steal from the vulnerable, and who killed to protect their carefully constructed secret when she threatened to expose them." The peaceful cottage parlor, which had witnessed so many quiet evenings of domestic tranquility, had become the stage for little Wickham's darkest revelation. Miss Marple knew, with the certainty that came from years of observing human nature in all its complexity, that the final confrontation was about to unfold and that justice, however long delayed, was finally within reach. The accusation hung in the cottage parlor like a death knell, its echoes seeming to penetrate the very walls of Dorothy's peaceful sanctuary. Mrs. Thornfield's elegant facade cracked visibly, her hands trembling as she gripped her handbag with desperate intensity, while Mr. Pritchard's professional composure dissolved into something approaching panic. The violet scent that had haunted various locations throughout the village seemed overwhelming now in the confined space, speaking eloquently of guilt and desperation finally cornered. Miss Marple observed their reactions with the gentle but penetrating attention that had unraveled so many carefully constructed deceptions over the years. From her knitting basket, she retrieved the collection of evidence that had been accumulating since the festival's dramatic discovery. The silver-blue thread with its telltale glitter, fragments of violet-scented paper bearing forged handwriting, and the small square of blotting paper that had revealed far more than its users ever intended. "The pattern has been there all along," she said quietly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as though she were discussing nothing more controversial than the weather. Mrs. Eversham's meticulous records, the Colonel's carefully worded letter, even the placement of evidence in the cake tin, all designed to guide the right person to the truth, if they possessed the wisdom to ask the proper questions. Mrs. Thornfield made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "You're creating elaborate fantasies based on coincidence and the confused ramblings of a woman who drank too much in her final months. These accusations are nothing more than malicious speculation." But Miss Marple's mild grey eyes held the kind of certainty that came from understanding human nature in all its complexity. Mrs. Eversham discovered that someone had been forging documents using paper scented with her distinctive violet water. She continued gently. Letters that appeared to come from her, but actually authorized actions she would never have approved. The garnet brooch wasn't stolen at all. It was taken as leverage for her silence, then carefully returned after her death to maintain the fiction that she had been confused and unreliable. The cottage door opened quietly to admit Lily Pike, her face pale but determined as she stepped into the charged atmosphere. In her trembling hands, she carried a small silver thistle brooch that caught the firelight with gentle gleams, and her presence seemed to bring with it the weight of 3 years' worth of carefully guarded secrets. "I heard voices raised in anger," Lily said simply, her gaze moving between Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Pritchard with a kind of recognition that spoke of long-suppressed memories finally surfacing. "The same desperate fury I heard that night through the library door, just before the shouting stopped and Mrs. Eversham fell." Mrs. Thornfield's composure finally shattered completely. "She was going to destroy everything," she burst out, her voice rising with hysteria. "All our work, all our planning, all the legitimate opportunities we had developed. She would have ruined it all with her suspicious mind and her obsessive record-keeping." The admission fell into the room like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples of shock and understanding. Timothy Fletcher pressed closer to his mother, his young face grave with the realization that he had witnessed something far more serious than childhood mischief. Dorothy, despite her frailty, leaned forward with sharp attention, her pale eyes bright with the satisfaction of seeing justice finally within reach. Mr. Pritchard, his professional dignity in tatters, made one last attempt at damage control. "We never intended for anyone to be hurt. The business arrangements were legitimate. We simply used our knowledge and position to ensure advantageous outcomes. Mrs. Eversham's death was an accident brought on by her own stubborn refusal to accept reasonable explanations." Miss Marple's expression remained compassionately understanding, though her words carried the inexorable weight of truth finally revealed. "Mrs. Eversham confronted you both on the evening she died, didn't she?" She had documented everything: the unauthorized key duplications, the forged authorizations, the manipulation of sale negotiations that allowed Meadowbrook to be purchased for far less than its true value. She threatened to take her evidence to the authorities unless you made full restitution. Mrs. Thornfield's laugh carried a bitter edge that seemed to crack the very air around them. She wanted us to confess publicly, to return money we had legitimately earned through superior knowledge and careful planning. She would have destroyed our reputations, our standing in the community, everything we had worked to build. Lily's voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of truth too long suppressed. I heard the confrontation from the servants' stairs. Mrs. Eversham accused them of fraud, said she had evidence that would see them both in prison. There was shouting, the sound of papers being scattered, and then Mrs. Thornfield screaming that she wouldn't let a dried-up old housekeeper destroy everything they had built. The peaceful cottage parlor had become the stage for little Wickham's most carefully guarded secret finally being dragged into the harsh light of truth. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly, understanding that the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the inevitable precision of a well-constructed mechanism finally allowed to complete its purpose. Mrs. Thornfield's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, her elegant facade completely abandoned now. It was an accident. She lunged at me when I tried to take her papers, and she lost her footing on those polished stairs. The brooch caught on my coat during the struggle, but I returned it the next morning. We never meant for her to die. Miss Marple's gentle grey eyes held infinite compassion for the human frailties that led to such tragic consequences, even as her voice carried the quiet authority of justice finally served. The truth, my dear, is that Mrs. Eversham was murdered to protect a carefully orchestrated fraud. The Colonel's letter and her own meticulous documentation have finally ensured that her voice, silenced for 3 long years, can at last be heard. The cottage fell into profound silence, broken only by Mrs. Thornfield's quiet weeping and the distant sound of footsteps approaching along the lane. Inspector Craddock, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier telephone call, arriving to take the confessions that would finally bring justice to little Wickham's most carefully concealed crime. Inspector Craddock's measured footsteps on the cottage path brought with them the weight of official authority, transforming Dorothy's peaceful parlor into the final stage where justice would at last be served. The inspector, a seasoned professional who had learned to trust Miss Marple's quiet observations above all else, took in the scene with practiced eyes, the scattered papers, the tear-stained faces of Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Pritchard, and the gentle but unmistakable air of truth finally revealed that seemed to emanate from Miss Marple herself. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, settling into the remaining chair while his constable positioned himself discreetly near the door, "I trust your telephone call was warranted. These are serious allegations." Miss Marple's mild grey eyes held the calm satisfaction of someone whose patient observation had finally borne fruit. From her knitting basket, she retrieved the ornate cake tin that young Timothy had fetched from the vicarage, setting it carefully on the table where everyone could see it clearly. "Inspector, I wonder if you might indulge me in a small demonstration," she said gently, her fingers working with characteristic precision. "I've learned over the years that the truth often reveals itself most clearly when people believe they are observing something else entirely." With deliberate care, she opened the tin's false compartment and placed a folded sheet of paper inside, closing it with a soft click. "I have placed within this compartment a copy of Mrs. Eversham's final documentation, the evidence that cost her life 3 years ago. The original, as Mr. Pritchard well knows, was taken from the church safe earlier this evening." Mrs. Thornfield stared at the tin as though it might burst into flames, her hands trembling visibly. Mr. Pritchard, however, leaned forward with the desperate calculation of a man testing exits in a burning room. "This is theatrical nonsense," he declared, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his words. "Even if such a document existed, which it doesn't, a copy would have no legal standing." Miss Marple smiled with gentle understanding. Of course not, Mr. Pritchard, but it would serve to remind one of certain specific details. The unauthorized key duplications documented in Mrs. Eversham's distinctive green ink. Green being reserved for household inventory, as you well know, while visitor entries were always recorded in black. The solicitor's face went ashen. I never said, that is, how could you possibly? You corrected me quite emphatically just moments ago, Miss Marple observed mildly, when I mistakenly suggested the entries were in green. Only someone intimately familiar with Mrs. Eversham's precise filing system would know such a specific detail. Inspector Craddock made a careful note, his expression revealing nothing but professional interest. Mrs. Thornfield made a small, broken sound and sank deeper into her chair, while Mr. Pritchard's composure finally cracked completely. The arrangement was perfectly legitimate, he burst out desperately. We simply used superior knowledge and careful timing to ensure advantageous outcomes. Mrs. Eversham's death was an accident. She lost her footing during an argument. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as the complete truth finally emerged. Mrs. Eversham had discovered the sophisticated fraud that had allowed Meadowbrook House to be purchased for a fraction of its true value. Using forged documents created with her distinctive violet-scented paper and unauthorized access gained through duplicated keys, the conspirators had systematically devalued the property while positioning themselves to benefit from the Ashford family's desperation. Lily Pike, her voice steady now with the courage that comes from finally speaking truth to power, provided the crucial testimony. She had witnessed the confrontation, heard Mrs. Thornfield's hysterical threats, and seen the garnet brooch torn from Mrs. Eversham's dress during the struggle. The same brooch that was carefully returned the following morning to support the fiction of the housekeeper's confused mental state. Young Timothy Fletcher, with the earnest precision that only children possess, confirmed the final pieces of evidence. He had observed Mrs. Thornfield tampering with the cake tin before the raffle, noted the distinctive silver-blue thread that connected her mended coat to the crime scene, and witnessed Mr. Pritchard providing her with the church keys for their desperate attempt to destroy the remaining evidence. As Inspector Craddock's constables moved forward to make the arrests, Mrs. Thornfield's elegant facade crumbled entirely. She was going to destroy everything we had built, she whispered, her voice hollow with defeat. All our careful planning, all our legitimate opportunities, ruined by a stubborn old woman who couldn't understand that sometimes progress requires difficult choices. Mr. Pritchard offered no further resistance, his professional dignity finally abandoned in the face of overwhelming evidence. The violet scent that had haunted various locations throughout the village seemed to dissipate as they were led away into the October night, replaced by the clean, crisp air of autumn and the quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. In the days that followed, Little Wickham slowly began to heal from the revelation that had shattered its peaceful facade. Mrs. Hartwell, finally free of the burden she had carried since discovering her late husband's suspicions, reclaimed her place in the community with quiet dignity. Lily Pike, having at last spoken her truth, found new strength and peace in her life with Ted. The village itself, like a garden after a necessary but painful pruning, began to grow stronger in the places where deception had been cut away. Miss Marple remained for several more days, observing with characteristic interest as the community adapted to its new understanding of itself. One afternoon, as she sat knitting by Dorothy's window and watching children play on the green where the fateful festival had taken place, she reflected on the enduring patterns of human nature that had guided her investigation. "It is always the same, my dear Dorothy," she mused, her voice soft with understanding. "Greed and fear drive people to terrible choices, but they invariably leave behind the small threads that eventually reveal the complete pattern. Mrs. Eversham's meticulous nature, the Colonel's careful planning, even the conspirators' own attention to detail, all contributed to ensuring that truth would eventually emerge." Dorothy, now recovering well from her illness, nodded with the wisdom that comes from witnessing life's complexities. And you, Jane, have the remarkable gift of seeing those threads when others see only tangled confusion." Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. "Perhaps, though I suspect it is simply a matter of understanding that people, however sophisticated their deceptions may appear, remain fundamentally predictable in their responses to fear and guilt. The challenge is learning to read the signs they cannot help but leave behind." As her visit to Little Wickham drew to a close, Miss Marple reflected that the village would carry forever the memory of what had been revealed, but it would also carry the deeper satisfaction of seeing justice prevail over even the most carefully constructed lies. The peaceful rhythm of rural life would continue, perhaps with a greater appreciation for the honesty and integrity that formed its true foundation. Mrs. Evesham could finally rest in peace, her loyalty vindicated and her meticulous documentation having served its ultimate purpose. The Colonel's posthumous letter had indeed guided the right person to the truth, proving that even death could not prevent justice from finding its way home to Little Wickham.